Hello and welcome to Economic Frontiers. I'm your host, Sean McGregor, and today we're diving into a topic that's gaining increasing attention in economic policy discussions around the world. Universal Basic Income, or UBI. We're incredibly fortunate to have with us today an expert in this field, Dr. Matthew Lawrence. Dr. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss such an important and transformative economic concept.
For our listeners who might be new to the concept, could you start by giving us a clear definition of what universal basic income actually is?
Absolutely. At its core, universal basic income is a social welfare proposal where all citizens or residents of a country receive a regular financial stipend unconditionally. The key aspects that define a true UBI are that it's universal, meaning everyone gets it regardless of their income or employment status. It's unconditional. There are no requirements to fulfill to receive it. It's individual, paid to each person rather than households, and it's regular, typically monthly or bi-weekly payments rather than a one-time grant.
That's very helpful. I think one question that immediately comes to mind for many people is, how would we possibly afford such a program? Let's talk about the economics of funding UBI.
That's certainly the million-dollar question, or perhaps the trillion-dollar question, to be more accurate. The funding mechanism is crucial to understanding both the feasibility and the economic impacts of UBI. There are several approaches to consider. First, we could implement progressive taxation reforms, where higher earners would effectively pay back their UBI through increased taxes. Another approach involves closing tax loopholes that currently benefit the wealthiest members of society. Some economists have proposed environmental taxes, such as carbon taxes, with the proceeds directed to UBI. There's also the possibility of establishing sovereign wealth funds, similar to what Alaska has done since 1982 with their permanent fund dividend. And finally, some proponents suggest certain public assets could be monetized, with returns distributed as dividends to citizens.
Those are certainly varied approaches. When we're talking about the economic implications, inflation is often cited as a concern. Critics argue that giving everyone more money would simply drive up prices. What does the research suggest about UBI and inflation?
This is a nuanced issue, Sean. If UBI is funded primarily through redistribution of existing money in the economy, rather than just printing new money, inflationary effects would likely be minimal. When we look at smaller-scale UBI experiments, we haven't seen significant inflation resulting from them. The key factor is whether UBI increases overall consumer purchasing power without a corresponding increase in goods and services. If productive capacity can expand to meet increased demand, inflation pressures would be limited. Some economists even suggest UBI could have deflationary effects in certain sectors by improving market efficiency and reducing economic inequality. It's worth noting that even when money supply has been expanded dramatically through quantitative easing, as we saw after 2008, when the Fed added over $4 trillion to the U.S. money supply, we didn't see the runaway inflation many had predicted.
That's fascinating. So the impact on inflation really depends on how the program is structured and funded. What about labor markets? A common argument against UBI is that it would discourage work. What does the evidence suggest?
The evidence from pilot programs has been quite revealing on this point. Contrary to what critics often suggest, UBI doesn't appear to significantly reduce workforce participation. In fact, in some cases, it can actually enhance it. For example, in the Finnish UBI experiment, there wasn't a noticeable decrease in employment among recipients. Similarly, experiments in Canada showed minimal impact on labor force participation. What we do see is shifts in how people work, perhaps reducing hours slightly, pursuing education or training, caring for family members, or exploring entrepreneurship. UBI provides what I call bargaining power to workers. It allows people to turn down exploitative employment conditions and hold out for better opportunities. This could ultimately lead to better working conditions and even higher wages in some sectors, particularly for low-wage workers.
That makes sense. UBI seems to give workers more options rather than simply encouraging them to leave the workforce entirely. Let's shift gears a bit and explore the social impacts. How might UBI affect poverty and inequality?
The potential for poverty reduction is perhaps the most significant social impact of UBI. By providing a floor below which no one falls, UBI directly addresses income insecurity. Modeling studies suggest that even a modest UBI could dramatically reduce official poverty rates. UBI is particularly effective because it reaches everyone, including those who might fall through the cracks of means-tested welfare programs. There's no stigma attached, no complex application processes, and no risk of losing benefits due to changes in circumstances. In terms of inequality, UBI wouldn't completely solve the problem. We'd still need progressive taxation and other policies, but it would compress the income distribution from the bottom, ensuring everyone has their basic needs met. This has profound implications for social cohesion and reducing the social costs associated with poverty.
Those social costs of poverty are substantial but often overlooked in economic discussions. Can you elaborate on how addressing poverty through UBI might create broader economic benefits?
Absolutely. There's growing recognition that poverty creates enormous costs for society that don't always show up in traditional economic measures. For instance, poverty contributes to poorer health outcomes, which increases healthcare costs. It's associated with higher crime rates, which leads to expenses in law enforcement and incarceration. Educational outcomes suffer, reducing future productivity. There are costs related to homelessness, food insecurity, and other social services. By establishing a floor that ensures basic needs are met, UBI could generate what economists call positive externalities, benefits that extend beyond the individual recipient. These include reduced healthcare costs, improved educational outcomes, decreased crime, and enhanced social cohesion. Some economists estimate that these savings could offset a significant portion of the gross cost of implementing UBI. This is why when discussing UBI funding, we need to consider both gross and net costs, the latter being substantially lower when we account for these social savings.
That's a compelling point about distinguishing between gross and net costs. I'd like to explore another aspect of UBI's social impact: mental health and well-being. How might financial security affect people psychologically?
The psychological impact of UBI is a fascinating area of research. Financial insecurity creates chronic stress, which has well-documented negative effects on physical and mental health. By providing a reliable income floor, UBI can significantly reduce this stress. In UBI pilot programs, we've seen improvements in mental health metrics, including reduced depression and anxiety. There's also evidence of improved cognitive function when financial worries are alleviated. This makes sense. When people aren't constantly worried about meeting basic needs, they have more mental bandwidth for other aspects of life.
Those benefits to mental health and cognitive function could have significant economic implications as well, couldn't they?
Absolutely. We know that stress and mental health challenges impair productivity, increase absenteeism, and reduce innovation. By improving mental well-being, UBI could enhance labor productivity and creativity economy-wide. There's also evidence that when people have financial security, they're more likely to take calculated risks, such as starting new businesses or investing in education and training. This entrepreneurial activity and human capital development are crucial drivers of economic growth. Furthermore, UBI could help address what economists call poverty traps in existing welfare systems, where recipients face high effective marginal tax rates if they increase their earnings. Since UBI is unconditional, it doesn't create these perverse incentives that can lock people into dependency.
Let's talk about some real-world applications. Various places have implemented different versions of basic income programs. Can you share some examples and what we've learned from them?
Certainly. While we haven't seen a full nationwide UBI implemented exactly as theorized, we have numerous valuable examples of programs that incorporate elements of UBI. Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend, which has been running since 1982, provides an annual payment to all residents from oil revenues. While the amount varies year to year, it's a true universal dividend. Finland conducted a 2-year experiment from 2017 to 2018, providing 2,000 unemployed Finns with a monthly stipend of €560, regardless of whether they found work. The results showed improved well-being without significant effects on employment. More recently, we've seen pilot programs in places like Stockton, California, where 125 residents received $500 per month for 2 years. Preliminary results showed recipients were more likely to find full-time work and reported better mental health. In Kenya, the charity Give Directly has been running a 12-year study providing basic income to thousands of people with promising initial results on economic activity and well-being. Each of these examples provides valuable data, though none perfectly replicates what a true national UBI would look like. The evidence so far suggests positive outcomes in well-being with limited negative effects on work incentives.
It sounds like we're still gathering evidence. Are there particular challenges or concerns about UBI that you think deserve more attention?
Yes, several important questions remain. One concern is the potential interaction between UBI and housing markets. If landlords know everyone has more income, would they simply raise rents, negating the benefits? This highlights the need for UBI to be part of a broader policy package that might include housing market reforms. Another challenge is political sustainability. Would a UBI program survive changes in government, or would it be vulnerable to cuts? The universality aspect might actually help here, as everyone would have a stake in maintaining the program. There's also the question of appropriate payment levels. Too low, and UBI wouldn't meaningfully address poverty. Too high, and funding becomes more challenging and work disincentives might increase. Finally, there are implementation challenges, particularly around inclusion. How do we ensure everyone receives their payments, including the unbanked, homeless individuals, or those without formal identification? These practical issues are solvable, but require careful planning.
Those are important considerations. As we begin to wrap up, I'd like to ask about the future. Do you see UBI becoming a mainstream policy in major economies in the coming decades?
I believe we're at an inflection point where UBI is shifting from a fringe idea to a serious policy consideration. Several factors are driving this: increasing awareness of inequality, concerns about technological unemployment, recognition of gaps in traditional welfare systems, and the unexpected experiences during the pandemic when many governments implemented emergency cash transfers. I think we'll continue to see an expansion of pilot programs and regional experiments. These will provide valuable data and help refine implementation strategies. We may also see incremental approaches, starting with specific demographics or with modest payment amounts that increase over time. The political dynamics around UBI are also evolving. It's interesting that UBI has supporters across the political spectrum, though often for different reasons. Progressives see it as addressing poverty and inequality, while some conservatives and libertarians appreciate its simplicity and reduction of bureaucracy. I wouldn't be surprised if within the next decade we see at least one developed nation implement something very close to a true UBI. And as with many major social policies throughout history, once one country demonstrates success, others may follow.
Dr. Lawrence, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like our listeners to understand about universal basic income?
I'd encourage listeners to approach UBI with both open-mindedness and critical thinking. There are legitimate questions about implementation and effects that we're still answering. At the same time, many of the knee-jerk objections to UBI don't hold up well to evidence. It's also important to recognize that UBI isn't a panacea. It's a powerful tool that could address certain problems, but it works best as part of a comprehensive approach to economic security and well-being. UBI alone won't solve issues like healthcare access, housing affordability, or climate change. Finally, I'd suggest thinking about UBI not just in economic terms, but as a reflection of our values as a society. Do we want to ensure everyone has their basic needs met? Do we trust individuals to make decisions about their own lives? These are deeper questions that underlie the technical debates about funding mechanisms and inflation effects.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been a fascinating exploration of universal basic income, from its economic implications to its potential social impacts. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of Economic Frontiers. If you found this discussion valuable, please subscribe to our podcast for more in-depth explorations of cutting-edge economic ideas. And join us next time when we'll be discussing the economics of climate adaptation. Until then, I'm Sean McGregor, wishing you prosperity and well-being.
I'm delighted to continue our conversation on universal basic income. In our previous discussion, we covered the fundamentals of UBI, funding mechanisms, and evidence from pilot programs. Today, I'd like to explore some additional dimensions, starting with implementation strategies across different countries. Dr. Lawrence, could you walk us through how various nations are approaching UBI implementation?
Certainly, Sean. When we look at implementation strategies globally, we see a spectrum of approaches. First, there are the targeted pilots, which aim to test specific aspects of UBI in controlled environments. Finland's 2017-2018 experiment, providing €560 monthly to 2,000 unemployed citizens, is one example. They focused specifically on labor market effects and well-being outcomes.
What about more expansive implementations?
Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend is perhaps the longest-running program with UBI-like features. Since 1982, it's provided annual payments to all residents from oil revenues. While the amount varies, typically between $1,000 to $2,000 annually, it demonstrates how resource dividends can fund a universal payment system. Another interesting case is Kenya, where Give Directly has been running a 12-year study providing regular payments to thousands of residents across multiple villages. This represents one of the most rigorous long-term studies of UBI effects in a developing economy.
Are there any new implementations that have emerged recently?
Yes, several regions have launched programs with UBI elements. Catalonia in Spain has been developing a basic income model that aims to both reduce poverty and improve labor market integration. South Korea has seen several municipal UBI experiments, including Gyeonggi Province's Youth Basic Income, providing quarterly payments to 24-year-olds. And in the United States, more cities are launching guaranteed income pilots, with some specifically designed to address racial wealth gaps or support specific demographics like single parents.
What lessons have we learned from these diverse implementation approaches?
Several key lessons stand out. First, administrative simplicity matters enormously. Programs that minimize bureaucracy and verification requirements tend to be more cost-effective and reach more people. Second, implementation needs to be culturally appropriate. What works in Finland may not work identically in Kenya. Third, there's increasing recognition that gradual implementation may be more politically sustainable than immediate nationwide rollouts. Starting with specific demographics or regions allows for testing, adjustment, and building political support before expansion.
That makes sense. Let's shift to another topic that often comes up in UBI discussions, technological automation. Many proponents argue that UBI will become necessary as automation displaces workers. What's your perspective on this relationship?
The automation question is complex, Sean. There's significant debate about the pace and extent of job displacement from AI and automation technologies. Some forecasts suggest that up to 45% of current jobs could be automated in the coming decades. However, history shows that technological disruption often creates new jobs alongside those it eliminates.
But this technological transition seems different, doesn't it?
There are reasons to think so. AI and machine learning are now capable of automating cognitive tasks that were previously thought to require human judgment. The potential pace of disruption may be faster than historical transitions, giving workers less time to adapt. Also, the new jobs created often require different skills than those displaced, potentially leading to structural unemployment.
How does UBI fit into addressing these automation challenges?
UBI can function as what economists call a technological dividend, ensuring that the productivity gains from automation are broadly shared rather than concentrated among technology owners. It provides economic security during career transitions, allowing people to retrain, relocate, or pursue entrepreneurship without facing destitution. This is particularly important because automation often hits specific geographic areas or industries especially hard, creating concentrated economic pain.
Some critics argue that focusing on automation as the primary rationale for UBI is problematic. What do you think about that critique?
That's a valid concern. Tying UBI exclusively to automation risks several problems. First, if automation proceeds more slowly than predicted, it could undermine support for UBI. Second, it frames UBI as merely a response to technological unemployment, rather than recognizing its broader benefits in reducing poverty and providing economic security. Third, it implicitly accepts technological determinism, the idea that we have no agency over how automation unfolds. In reality, we have choices about which technologies to develop and deploy, and how to shape markets and institutions around them.
That's a nuanced perspective. Let's address another crucial question, the long-term economic sustainability of UBI. Critics often argue that UBI is simply unaffordable over the long term. How would you respond?
The sustainability question requires distinguishing between gross and net costs. The gross cost, simply multiplying the payment amount by the population, is indeed substantial. For example, a $12,000 annual UBI in the United States would have a gross cost of around $4 trillion. However, the net cost is significantly lower when we consider several factors.
What factors reduce the net cost?
First, UBI would replace or reduce spending on existing welfare programs. Second, much of UBI's cost recirculates through the economy via increased consumer spending, generating tax revenue. Third, UBI could likely generate significant savings in areas like healthcare, criminal justice, and other social services by reducing poverty's negative externalities. Fourth, UBI could potentially improve labor market efficiency and productivity by allowing workers to find better job matches and pursue education or entrepreneurship without facing destitution.
You mentioned incorporating environmental taxes as a funding source. Could you elaborate on the connection between UBI and environmental sustainability?
There's a fascinating link between UBI and environmental goals. Many environmentalists now advocate for what's called a carbon dividend, essentially taxing carbon emissions and returning the revenue directly to citizens as a UBI. This approach addresses both climate change and economic inequality simultaneously. It puts a price on pollution while ensuring that the transition to a green economy doesn't disproportionately burden lower-income households. Some research suggests this dual approach could help build broader political support for climate action.
That's a compelling connection. Now, let's address head-on some of the critiques and counter-arguments against UBI. What do you see as the most substantive critiques?
One serious critique concerns labor market effects. Some economists worry that UBI might reduce work incentives, particularly among lower-wage workers. While the evidence from pilots suggests minimal employment reductions, these pilots were typically limited in duration and scope. The long-term effects of a permanent, nationwide UBI might differ.
What about inflation concerns? We touched on this briefly in our last conversation.
The inflation concern remains significant, particularly in sectors with inelastic supply like housing. If landlords know everyone has an extra $1,000 per month, they might raise rents accordingly, negating UBI's benefits. This underscores why UBI likely needs to be coupled with housing market reforms to be fully effective.
Critics also sometimes make moral or philosophical arguments against UBI. How would you characterize those?
The reciprocity argument is perhaps the most common moral critique. The idea that benefits should be conditional on willingness to contribute through work. There's also concern about UBI undermining the centrality of work to social identity and purpose. Some conservatives worry it could erode traditional family structures by reducing economic interdependence, while some progressives worry it might serve as a substitute for needed structural reforms in labor markets, healthcare, and education.
How do you respond to the targeting critique that giving money to everyone is inefficient compared to targeting those in need?
The targeting argument has mathematical appeal. If resources are limited, directing them to those in greatest need seems logical. However, targeted programs come with significant downsides: administrative complexity, stigmatization, high marginal tax rates as benefits phase out, and the reality that many eligible people fall through the cracks. Universal programs tend to be more politically durable and avoid creating divisions between those who receive benefits and those who only pay for them. As the saying goes, programs for the poor become poor programs.
A final critique I'd like to address is the political feasibility question. Some argue that regardless of UBI's merits, it simply isn't politically achievable. What's your view?
Political feasibility is not static. It evolves with changing circumstances and public discourse. 20 years ago, UBI was considered a fringe idea. Now it's regularly debated in mainstream politics. The pandemic response, which included direct cash payments to citizens in many countries, helped normalize the concept of governmental cash transfers. I think gradual implementation pathways, starting with specific demographics or modest payment amounts, could build the political coalition needed for broader adoption.
As we look to the future of UBI, what developments are you most excited about or paying closest attention to?
I'm particularly interested in the intersection of UBI with other policy domains. For instance, how UBI might complement climate policy through carbon dividends. I'm watching the growing interest in UBI as part of racial justice initiatives, addressing historical inequities through targeted programs that could eventually expand universally. And I'm fascinated by potential public-private partnerships where technology companies that benefit from automation might contribute to funding UBI, creating a more direct link between technological progress and shared prosperity.
That's a hopeful vision. Before we conclude, I'd like to ask you to reflect on a broader question. How might widespread UBI adoption change our fundamental relationship with work and economic participation?
That's a profound question, Sean. UBI could potentially facilitate what philosopher Andre Gordes called the liberation from work, not eliminating meaningful labor, but freeing people from economic coercion to work under any conditions simply to survive. This might allow for a society where people have greater freedom to pursue intrinsically rewarding activities, whether that's care work, creative pursuits, community service, or entrepreneurial ventures that might not immediately generate profit.
So UBI could represent a shift in how we conceptualize the relationship between economic value and human flourishing.
Exactly. At its core, UBI challenges the notion that one's economic contribution should determine their right to basic security and dignity. It recognizes that many valuable forms of social contribution go uncompensated in markets: raising children, caring for elderly parents, volunteering, creating art, or simply being a good neighbor. By providing a floor of economic security, UBI might allow for a broader conception of social contribution beyond market labor. As our technological capabilities continue to expand, reimagining this relationship between work, income, and meaning becomes increasingly important.
Dr. Lawrence, this has been another illuminating conversation. You've helped us explore implementation strategies, technological connections, sustainability questions, and important critiques of UBI. Thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience.
It's been my pleasure, Sean. These are complex questions without simple answers, but I believe the ongoing experimentation and debate around UBI reflects a healthy democratic engagement with how we want to structure our economic relationships. I'm hopeful that continued research and dialogue will help refine approaches that can reduce poverty, increase economic security, and create more just and sustainable societies.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for the second installment of our exploration of universal basic income. If you found these insights valuable, please share this podcast with others interested in economic policy innovation. And join us next time on Economic Frontiers, when we'll be discussing the economics of climate adaptation. Until then, I'm Sean McGregor, wishing you prosperity and well-being.
Let's expand our discussion on global UBI implementations. We've talked about Alaska and Finland, but there's a fascinating landscape of initiatives worldwide that offer valuable insights. Dr. Lawrence, could you elaborate on some of the lesser-known but significant UBI experiments?
Absolutely, Sean. One compelling case study comes from Brazil, where the Maricá municipality has implemented what they call the Mamunca program. Since 2019, they've provided about 42,000 residents, roughly one-third of the city's population, with a monthly income of 130 reais, which is approximately 25% of Brazil's minimum wage.
What effects have they observed from this program?
The results have been particularly noteworthy during the pandemic. When COVID-19 hit, Maricá quickly doubled the benefit, providing crucial support when people needed it most. Local businesses remained afloat, and poverty levels decreased significantly compared to surrounding regions. What's particularly innovative about this program is that payments are made in a local digital currency, which can only be spent within the municipality, ensuring the economic benefits remain in the community.
That's fascinating, using a local currency to amplify the economic multiplier effect. Are there other implementations with unique approaches?
India has conducted several intriguing experiments, particularly in Madhya Pradesh, where they ran a 12-month UBI pilot across 8 villages between 2011 and 2012. Every man, woman, and child received monthly payments without conditions. The results showed improved nutrition, health outcomes, school attendance, and economic activity. Women's empowerment was a particularly notable outcome, with increased financial independence and decision-making authority within households.
These examples suggest UBI can have culturally specific benefits beyond the universal ones we've discussed. What about developed economies beyond the Finnish experiment?
Germany launched a 3-year study in 2021 where 122 participants received 1,200 euros monthly, just above their poverty line. It's being compared with a control group of 1,380 people who don't receive payments. Early indicators suggest improvements in mental well-being and financial security without significant labor market withdrawal. The Netherlands has also implemented municipal-level experiments in cities like Utrecht, focusing on simplifying their welfare system while removing punitive elements.
We've discussed automation as a driver for UBI previously, but how are technology-focused economies approaching this?
South Korea offers an interesting perspective here. Their youth basic income in Gyeonggi province specifically targets young adults entering a competitive job market transformed by automation. Each participant receives approximately $850 quarterly. Initial data suggests participants report lower stress levels and are more willing to explore entrepreneurship or further education rather than accepting precarious employment just to survive.
These examples demonstrate the versatility of UBI across different economic contexts. Let's pivot to the political landscape surrounding UBI. What coalitions or political arrangements seem most conducive to implementing these programs?
What's fascinating about UBI is its potential for cross-ideological appeal, though often for different reasons. Progressive advocates emphasize poverty reduction and economic security, while libertarian supporters appreciate its administrative simplicity and individual autonomy. The most successful implementation attempts have built coalitions that speak to multiple values simultaneously.
Can you give an example of where this coalition building has worked effectively?
Alaska's permanent fund dividend is instructive here. Initially established under Republican Governor Jay Hammond, it's now politically untouchable despite Alaska's changing political landscape. The program appeals to conservative values of individual freedom and direct citizen ownership of resources, while simultaneously addressing progressive concerns about inequality and shared prosperity. Any politician suggesting reductions to the dividend faces significant electoral consequences.
What about the politics of funding? That seems to be where consensus breaks down.
You've identified a crucial point. The politics of funding is often where UBI proposals encountered their greatest resistance. Carbon dividend proposals have shown promise in building unusual coalitions, bringing together environmental advocates and those concerned about regressive effects of carbon taxes. Similarly, sovereign wealth funds like Alaska's model can attract broad support by framing benefits as dividends from shared resources rather than redistribution through taxation.
How important is framing in the political viability of UBI?
Framing is absolutely essential. When UBI is presented as free money or government handouts, it immediately triggers resistance. When framed as a social dividend, citizens' dividend, or prosperity share, it connects to different cultural narratives about deservingness and ownership. The pandemic response has shifted this framing landscape significantly. Direct cash payments are now within people's lived experience, making them less abstract.
That's a crucial point about the pandemic's impact on perceptions. Let's address some of the persistent criticisms of UBI that we haven't fully covered yet. One concern is the potential for UBI to enable harmful behaviors like substance abuse. What does the evidence tell us?
This criticism stems from paternalistic assumptions about how people in poverty make decisions. The evidence from cash transfer programs, including UBI pilots, consistently contradicts these assumptions. In the Stockton, California Guaranteed Income Experiment, less than 1% of tracked spending went to alcohol or tobacco. Similar patterns emerge in international studies. People generally use unconditional cash to meet basic needs, invest in education or entrepreneurship, or address previously neglected health concerns.
What about the argument that UBI might drive inflation, particularly in housing markets? We touched on this before, but it remains a significant concern.
This is a legitimate concern that requires nuanced policy responses. In markets with inelastic supply, particularly housing in areas with restrictive zoning, increased purchasing power could indeed drive up prices. This underscores why UBI should be part of a comprehensive policy approach that includes housing market reforms, anti-monopoly enforcement, and supply-side interventions. UBI alone isn't a silver bullet. It's most effective as part of a broader policy ecosystem.
Critics also argue that UBI undermines the dignity and purpose that comes from work. How would you respond?
I'd challenge the premise that paid employment is the only source of meaningful contribution or dignity. UBI could actually enhance dignity by recognizing unpaid care work, community service, artistic creation, and other valuable activities not captured by labor markets. It could empower people to refuse degrading or exploitative working conditions. Rather than undermining the value of work, UBI might help us develop a healthier relationship with work by removing the desperation factor from employment decisions.
That's a powerful reframing. Let's look toward the future. Where do you see UBI heading in the next decade?
I anticipate several parallel developments. First, we'll see continued expansion of municipal and regional pilots, particularly in Europe and North America. These will provide increasingly robust longitudinal data on UBI's effects. Second, developing economies may leapfrog developed nations in implementing nationwide programs by integrating UBI with digital payment infrastructure. India's Unified Payments Interface, combined with Aadhaar identification, presents such an opportunity.
Do you expect any full national implementations in developed economies?
Within the next decade, I think we'll see at least one developed nation implement something very close to a true UBI. Scotland has shown serious interest, with multiple feasibility studies already completed. Spain's minimum vital income could evolve toward universality. Perhaps most promising is the concept of UBI-like stepping stones, programs that incorporate some but not all UBI features initially, then gradually expand toward true universality and unconditionality.
What technological developments might influence UBI implementation in the coming years?
Digital payment infrastructure is rapidly evolving, making large-scale cash transfer programs increasingly feasible from an administrative perspective. Blockchain and digital currency technologies could potentially reduce transaction costs and enable new funding mechanisms through microtransactions or data dividends. AI tools are improving our ability to model economic impacts and optimize program design. These technological enablers are removing many of the practical objections to UBI implementation.
What about the evolution of UBI alongside other economic trends like the gig economy and remote work?
There's a compelling synergy between UBI and these evolving work patterns. As employment becomes more precarious and episodic for many workers, UBI provides a stable floor that could enable healthier participation in the gig economy by choice rather than desperation. Remote work is decoupling jobs from location, potentially allowing people to live in lower-cost areas while maintaining income. UBI could accelerate this geographic flexibility, revitalizing depopulating regions and relieving pressure on housing markets in employment centers.
As we look to potential futures with UBI, what indicators or metrics should we be watching to evaluate success?
Beyond traditional economic measures like poverty rates and labor force participation, we should monitor health outcomes, both physical and mental, as well as indicators of community vitality and social cohesion. Self-reported well-being and life satisfaction are crucial metrics that economists have historically undervalued. Entrepreneurship rates, educational attainment, and time use patterns would provide insights into how UBI affects human capital development and innovation. And importantly, we should track disparate impacts across demographics to ensure UBI is advancing equity rather than reinforcing existing advantages.
Are there any misconceptions about UBI that you think are particularly important to address as we conclude?
One persistent misconception is that UBI is inherently expensive. While the gross cost appears high when multiplying payment amounts by population, the net fiscal impact depends entirely on the funding mechanism, existing program offsets, and dynamic economic effects. Another misconception is framing UBI as an all-or-nothing proposition, when in reality there's a spectrum of implementation options that can be tailored to specific contexts and gradually evolved.
Perhaps the most fundamental misconception is that UBI represents a radical departure from existing social policy, when in fact it could be viewed as a streamlining and rationalization of our current patchwork of income support programs.
Precisely. And I'd add one final thought. UBI shouldn't be evaluated in isolation, but considered as part of a broader reconceptualization of the social contract for the 21st century economy. The question isn't simply whether to implement UBI, but how to design economic institutions that ensure prosperity is broadly shared while enhancing human freedom and dignity. UBI is one powerful tool toward that larger goal.
Dr. Lawrence, thank you for this illuminating three-part exploration of universal basic income. We've covered a remarkable breadth from theoretical foundations and funding mechanisms to real-world implementations and future possibilities. I believe our listeners now have a comprehensive understanding of both the promise and challenges of UBI.
It's been my pleasure, Sean. UBI represents one of the most significant policy innovations of our time, with potential to transform our economic landscape. I hope our discussion helps listeners engage more deeply with these ideas as they increasingly enter mainstream political discourse.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this special three-part series on universal basic income. I'm Sean McGregor, and you've been listening to Economic Frontiers. Until next time, keep exploring the boundaries of economic possibility.
Welcome back to our continuing series on universal basic income. In our previous episodes, we've explored the fundamentals of UBI, examined various implementation strategies around the world, and discussed both theoretical frameworks and practical outcomes from different pilots. Today, we'll delve deeper into implementation challenges, potential solutions, and future directions for UBI, specifically in developed economies.
I'm looking forward to this discussion, Sean. While we've covered a broad spectrum of UBI implementations globally, developed economies face their own unique set of challenges and opportunities when considering universal basic income programs.
Let's start with the implementation challenges specific to developed economies. What are the most significant hurdles these nations face when attempting to transition from targeted welfare systems to universal programs?
The first major challenge is the complexity of existing welfare infrastructures. Developed economies typically have extensive, multi-layered social safety nets with numerous programs, eligibility requirements, and administrative structures. Transitioning from these complex systems to a streamlined UBI involves difficult questions about which programs to replace, which to maintain alongside UBI, and how to ensure no vulnerable populations experience disruption during the transition.
That makes sense. I imagine there are significant institutional inertias in those existing systems as well.
Precisely. There are entrenched bureaucracies, service providers, and political constituencies that have vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Many welfare professionals genuinely worry about removing targeted supports for those with specific needs. Any transition strategy needs to address these legitimate concerns while still moving toward a more universal approach.
Beyond institutional challenges, what about fiscal constraints? Developed economies often have significant public debt and aging populations requiring increased healthcare and pension spending.
That's a critical challenge. The fiscal pressures of aging demographics are indeed substantial. In many OECD countries, pension and healthcare expenditures are projected to grow by several percentage points of GDP over the coming decades. Introducing UBI within these fiscal constraints requires careful consideration of funding mechanisms. However, it's worth noting that UBI doesn't necessarily represent a net increase in social spending if it replaces or consolidates existing programs. The key is designing a UBI system that achieves policy goals within fiscal reality. This might mean starting with modest payment levels that can grow as fiscal space allows, or implementing UBI in phases.
I've also heard concerns about how UBI might interact with immigration policies in developed nations. Could you address that potential challenge?
This is indeed a complex issue. Critics argue that combining open immigration with universal benefits could create unsustainable fiscal pressures through what economists call welfare magnets, the attraction of migrants specifically for benefits. There are several potential approaches to this challenge. One is residency requirements, where UBI eligibility is tied to legal residency of a specified duration. Another approach involves graduated benefits, where full UBI rights accrue progressively with time spent as a legal resident. Some proposals suggest a contributory element for new residents, similar to how many nations structure pension eligibility. Importantly, research on migration motivations consistently shows that employment opportunities and family connections drive migration decisions far more than welfare benefits. The welfare magnet concern may be overstated, but it needs thoughtful policy design nonetheless.
We've touched on the inflation concern in previous episodes, but could you specifically address how developed economies might mitigate potential inflationary effects of UBI?
Inflation risks are most acute in sectors with supply constraints, particularly housing in high-demand areas. Developed economies have several tools available to mitigate these risks. First, monetary policy tools remain effective in managing general inflation pressures. Second, housing-specific policies are crucial, relaxing zoning restrictions to increase supply, implementing anti-speculation measures, and investing in public and affordable housing. Third, the funding mechanism matters enormously. If UBI is funded through progressive taxation, rather than deficit spending or monetary creation, the net increase in purchasing power is limited, reducing inflation risk. Essentially, this approach redistributes existing purchasing power rather than creating new purchasing power. Finally, phased implementation allows markets time to adapt supply to meet increased demand, smoothing potential price impacts.
Given these challenges, what implementation strategies have proven most promising for developed economies considering UBI?
Several promising strategies have emerged. The first is starting with partial or categorical UBI, providing universal benefits to specific demographic groups. Examples include child allowances, youth basic income like South Korea's program, or senior basic income that supplement existing pension systems. These programs build administrative capacity and public support while demonstrating benefits. Another approach is geographical implementation, starting with regions facing specific economic challenges. Scotland has explored this through proposed pilots in areas with high unemployment following industrial decline. A third strategy is gradual universalization of existing programs. For instance, taking a modest unemployment benefit and progressively removing conditionality and means testing, eventually transforming it into a basic income.
How important is technological infrastructure in enabling successful UBI implementation?
It's absolutely crucial. Fortunately, most developed economies have robust financial systems and high levels of banking access, which simplifies payment distribution. Countries like Estonia, with advanced digital identity systems and integrated government services, are particularly well positioned for efficient UBI administration. Recent innovations in digital payment systems can further reduce administrative costs while improving access. For example, some UBI pilots have experimented with mobile payment platforms that don't require traditional bank accounts, potentially reaching unbanked populations more effectively. Automated tax systems that update in real time can also facilitate UBI funding through progressive taxation, ensuring higher earners effectively return their UBI through taxes while avoiding the bureaucratic complexity of means testing.
Let's explore the connection between UBI and public services. Some critics worry that UBI could be used to justify cutting public services. How should developed economies approach this relationship?
This is a legitimate concern that requires clear policy principles. UBI works best as a complement to robust public services, not a replacement. Cash transfers and public services serve different functions. Cash provides choice and flexibility for individual needs, while public services address collective needs and market failures. Healthcare is a perfect example. Even with UBI, private healthcare markets would still face information asymmetries, adverse selection problems, and other market failures that make public provision necessary. Similarly, education, infrastructure, and environmental protection remain essential public goods, regardless of income support policies.
That makes sense. Let's shift to political feasibility. What political strategies have proven effective in building support for UBI in developed democracies?
Several promising strategies have emerged. First, coalition building across ideological lines by emphasizing different aspects of UBI that appeal to different constituencies. Progressive advocates can highlight poverty reduction and gender equality benefits, while conservatives and libertarians might appreciate administrative simplicity and reduced bureaucracy. Second, incremental implementation helps build public support through demonstrated success. Rather than proposing an immediate full UBI, starting with partial programs allows voters to experience benefits directly, creating constituencies for preservation and expansion. Third, framing matters enormously. When UBI is presented as a dividend or share rather than a handout, it connects to broadly shared values about economic participation and fairness. Alaska's framing of their dividend as citizens' rightful share of common resources has created durable support across the political spectrum.
Looking at concrete examples, are there any developed economies that seem particularly close to implementing something resembling a true UBI?
Several jurisdictions are making significant progress. Scotland has conducted extensive feasibility studies and has political leadership committed to the concept, though constitutional arrangements with the UK government create complications. Spain's minimum vital income, while currently means-tested, has been explicitly described by its architects as a stepping stone toward more universal approaches. Finland, despite ending its initial pilot, has continued policy discussions about expanding universal elements in its social security system. South Korea's expanding local UBI initiatives may eventually lead to national consideration. And several European political parties now include UBI or UBI-like policies in their platforms, suggesting potential implementation when electoral conditions align.
As we look to the future, how might technological and economic trends influence the evolution of UBI in developed economies?
Several trends are converging that may accelerate UBI adoption. First, advancing automation and AI technologies continue to transform labor markets, potentially increasing support for UBI as a stabilizing force during economic transitions. Second, The growing precarity of work, from gig economy expansion to increased contract work without benefits, is highlighting gaps in traditional employment-based social protection systems. UBI offers a potential solution by providing security regardless of employment status. Third, demographic shifts in many developed economies with aging populations and declining birth rates may eventually necessitate immigration-friendly policies. UBI could help integrate newcomers while providing security for existing residents navigating economic changes. Finally, the increasing recognition of unpaid care work, predominantly performed by women, may drive interest in UBI as a way to value these essential contributions that market economies currently ignore.
Data and evidence are crucial for policy development. What research gaps need to be addressed to better inform UBI implementation in developed economies?
Several key questions require further research. First, we need more long-term studies examining behavioral responses to permanent UBI. Most existing pilots are time-limited, which may not capture how people would respond to a guaranteed lifetime income floor. Second, we need better models of macroeconomic effects, particularly how different funding mechanisms might impact growth, inflation, and labor markets at scale. Third, we need more research on interaction effects between UBI and other policies would help optimize policy packages. Finally, we need implementation research that examines the nuts and bolts of transitioning from current systems to UBI, addressing questions about phase-in strategies, administrative structures, and minimizing disruption for vulnerable populations.
As we conclude our series on universal basic income, what final thoughts would you like to share about the future of UBI in developed economies?
I believe we're at an inflection point where UBI is transitioning from theoretical discussion to practical implementation. The combination of technological change, evolving work patterns, and the lived experience of pandemic-era cash transfers has shifted the policy landscape significantly. The path forward will likely involve policy innovation and experimentation rather than immediate widespread adoption. Different jurisdictions will develop varied approaches based on their existing institutions and political contexts. Some may implement full UBI, while others develop UBI-like policies that incorporate core principles while adapting to local conditions. What's most encouraging is the increasingly evidence-based nature of these discussions. As more data emerges from various implementations, we can move beyond ideological debates to pragmatic assessments of what works in achieving shared goals of economic security, freedom, and human flourishing. The question is shifting from whether UBI could work to how it can be designed and implemented most effectively. That represents remarkable progress for an idea that was considered utopian just a decade ago.
Dr. Lawrence, thank you for this comprehensive exploration of universal basic income across our four-part series. We've covered everything from fundamental concepts to implementation challenges and future directions. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this in-depth examination of one of the most significant policy innovations being considered in economies worldwide. I hope this series has provided valuable insights into both the promise and complexity of universal basic income. This is Sean McGregor for Economic Frontiers. Until next time.
Welcome back to Economic Frontiers. I'm Sean McGregor, and we're continuing our exploration of universal basic income. In our previous episodes, we've covered the fundamental concepts, implementation strategies, and challenges facing UBI. Today, in our fifth installment, we'll be examining the latest developments in UBI experiments worldwide and making some informed predictions about the future trajectory of these programs. Dr. Lawrence, it's great to have you back with us.
Thank you, Sean. It's always a pleasure to continue this important conversation. There have been some fascinating developments in the UBI landscape since our last discussion, and I'm eager to share insights from the newest research and implementations.
Let's begin with some of the most recent and compelling case studies. I understand there's been a particularly notable long-term study in Germany that's recently concluded.
Yes, the Mein Grunde Ankommen study in Germany has produced remarkable findings. From 2021 to 2024, they followed 122 people who received an unconditional sum of €1,200, about $1,365 per month. The study focused on individuals aged 21 to 40, living alone with modest existing incomes.
And what were the key findings? I imagine the work incentive question was central to their investigation.
That's exactly right. One of the most significant findings directly challenged the common critique that UBI would discourage work. The study found that participants continued to work an average of 40 hours per week, identical to the control group that received no payments. What changed wasn't whether people worked, but how they engaged with work.
How so?
Recipients reported greater job satisfaction and were more likely to change jobs or pursue further education. They described their lives as more valuable and meaningful, with clear improvements in mental health. Perhaps most interestingly, especially for women, there was an increased sense of autonomy. Despite working the same hours, they perceived having more time for activities like sleeping, volunteering, and spending time with loved ones.
That's fascinating. The objective time remained the same, but the subjective experience of time transformed. It suggests that financial security changes our relationship with time itself.
Precisely. When financial stress is elevated, people experience what psychologists call bandwidth recovery. Mental resources previously consumed by financial worry become available for other activities. The German study provides compelling evidence that UBI doesn't just address material poverty, but also what we might call time poverty and attention poverty.
Another recent innovation I've been following is the intersection between UBI and digital currencies. Could you tell us about some of these developments?
This is an exciting frontier. The Future First program in New York City represents a fascinating hybrid, a UBI experiment utilizing stablecoin technology. Selected low-income residents receive a total of $12,000 in USDC, a cryptocurrency pegged to the US dollar.
How exactly does that work?
Participants receive $8,000 upfront to help with housing or education, followed by 5 monthly payments of $800. They manage these funds through a Coinbase wallet with options to withdraw cash, transfer to another wallet, or spend directly with a crypto card. It's a collaboration between Coinbase and Give Directly, focusing on financial freedom and improving the welfare experience.
What are the advantages of using stablecoins for UBI distribution?
Unlike volatile cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, stablecoins offer price stability, crucial for consistent welfare payments. Blockchain technology potentially makes distribution cheaper, more efficient, and more transparent. In crisis situations, this could mean getting support to people more quickly without traditional banking infrastructure. Additionally, the programmable nature of digital currencies allows for innovative distribution mechanisms and potentially reduces administrative overhead.
Are there risks or challenges specific to this approach?
Absolutely. Digital literacy remains a significant barrier. Some participants have reported difficulties managing their crypto wallets. There's also the regulatory uncertainty surrounding cryptocurrencies globally. And while stablecoins are designed to maintain their value, there have been instances of stablecoins losing their pegs, which could undermine the security and predictability essential for UBI.
It sounds like these digital currency implementations could be particularly valuable in regions with less developed banking systems or unstable national currencies.
That's a key insight. While developed economies might see marginal efficiency gains, the transformative potential is perhaps greatest in developing regions with lower banking penetration or currency volatility. A blockchain-based UBI could provide financial inclusion and stability simultaneously, reaching the unbanked while providing a reliable store of value.
Let's shift to another emerging trend, the integration of UBI with environmental policies. We touched on this briefly in earlier episodes, but there seems to be growing momentum behind these approaches.
Indeed, the concept of a climate dividend or a carbon dividend is gaining significant traction. This approach ties UBI funding to environmental taxation, particularly carbon taxes, creating a dual benefit, reducing emissions while providing economic security. The idea is elegantly simple. Place a price on carbon emissions, collect the revenue, and distribute it equally to all citizens as a dividend. This addresses both climate change and inequality simultaneously, while potentially building broader political support for climate action.
How do these models differ from traditional carbon tax proposals?
Traditional carbon taxes face political resistance because they can be regressive, disproportionately affecting lower-income households who spend more of their income on energy. By returning the revenue as an equal dividend to all citizens, the climate dividend approach ensures that most lower and middle-income households come out financially ahead, even as energy prices increase. Several jurisdictions are exploring variants of this model. Switzerland has implemented a partial carbon dividend system, returning a portion of carbon tax revenues to households via health insurance premium reductions. Canada's federal carbon pricing system returns revenues to households in provinces without their own carbon pricing systems. And there are growing campaigns for more comprehensive climate dividend policies in numerous countries.
This seems to exemplify how UBI can address multiple policy goals simultaneously, in this case, environmental sustainability and economic security.
Exactly. This multi-solving approach could be key to UBI's political viability. When UBI serves multiple policy objectives, reducing poverty, addressing technological disruption, advancing environmental goals, it can build broader coalitions than single-purpose policies. The climate dividend model is particularly promising because it transforms what could be perceived as an economic burden, carbon taxation, into a tangible benefit that citizens can see in their bank accounts.
Looking more broadly at the UBI landscape, what overall trends do you see emerging? How has the conversation evolved since we started this series?
Several clear trends have emerged. First, we're seeing a shift from short-term pilots to longer-duration studies, like the 3-year German experiment we discussed. This provides more robust data on behavioral changes and allows researchers to distinguish between temporary responses and lasting adaptations. Second, there's greater attention to UBI's role in economic resilience. The pandemic demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional safety nets, and many policymakers now view UBI as a potential stabilizer during crises. South Korea's disaster relief payments during COVID-19 functioned as a temporary UBI and gained significant public support.
What about technological implementation? You mentioned digital currencies, but are there other innovations changing how UBI is delivered?
Definitely. Beyond blockchain, we're seeing innovations in digital identity systems that could facilitate more efficient UBI administration. Estonia's digital governance infrastructure demonstrates how secure online identification can streamline benefit distribution. India's combination of the Aadhaar biometric ID system with direct benefit transfers provides another model, though privacy concerns remain. Machine learning algorithms are also being employed to better understand UBI's impact, analyzing vast data sets to identify patterns and outcomes across different demographics and contexts. This could help policymakers optimize program design for maximum positive impact.
As we look toward the future, what predictions would you make about UBI adoption globally over the next decade?
I foresee several parallel developments. At the municipal and regional levels, we'll continue to see an expansion of targeted UBI programs, particularly for specific demographics like youth or in areas facing economic transition. Cities will remain laboratories for UBI innovation, with more mayors for guaranteed income initiatives spreading across continents. At national levels, I expect we'll see more countries adopt what we might call UBI-adjacent policies, universal child benefits, expanded basic pensions, or other categorical basic income that establish the infrastructure and normalization of universal payments. These could serve as stepping stones towards more comprehensive UBI.
Do you think any countries are close to implementing a full national UBI?
Several countries are positioning themselves for potential implementation. Scotland has conducted extensive feasibility studies and has strong political support for the concept.
South Korea's local experiments could scale nationally with the right political alignment. Spain's minimum vital income program was explicitly designed as a stepping stone toward universality. However, I believe the first national implementation may come from an unexpected direction, perhaps a middle-income country with a strong digital infrastructure and political will for bold reforms. A country like Kenya, which has participated in some of the most extensive UBI trials, might leapfrog wealthier nations in implementation if it can integrate UBI with its mobile payment systems and growing digital economy.
What factors will determine whether these initiatives scale successfully?
3 critical factors will determine scalability. First, sustainable funding mechanisms, whether through conventional taxation, natural resource dividends, or innovative approaches like data dividends. Second, technological infrastructure for efficient administration. Countries with advanced digital identity systems and payment networks are better positioned to minimize overhead costs. Third, and perhaps most crucial, is political sustainability. UBI programs need to create constituencies that will defend them from budget cuts or policy reversals. This depends partly on program design. Universal programs typically generate broader support than targeted ones, and partly on effective communication of benefits.
You mentioned data dividends. Could you elaborate on that concept?
Certainly. The data dividend concept recognizes that personal data has become a valuable resource in the digital economy, yet individuals receive little compensation for the data they generate. A data dividend would impose fees on companies profiting from data collection and analysis, with revenues distributed to citizens as a universal dividend. California has explored legislation along these lines, and there are growing calls for similar approaches in Europe and elsewhere. It's conceptually similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, but with data rather than oil as the common resource being monetized.
That's fascinating. It creates a new resource for UBI funding that didn't exist in previous economic eras. Looking beyond funding, what do you see as the most significant remaining research gaps in UBI studies?
Despite the growing body of evidence, several crucial research gaps remain. First, we need more long-term studies examining multi-generational effects. Most existing trials last 3 years at most, but the most profound impacts might unfold over decades, particularly in education, health, and intergenerational mobility. Second, we need better understanding of community-wide effects when UBI reaches critical mass. Individual-level randomized trials can't capture how communities might transform when universal coverage is achieved. Third, more research is needed on optimal integration with other policies and services. UBI doesn't exist in isolation. Its effects interact with healthcare systems, housing markets, education, and other social policies. Understanding these interactions is essential for maximizing positive outcomes.
As we conclude our 5-part series on universal basic income, what final reflections would you like to share with our listeners?
UBI represents one of the most ambitious reimaginings of the social contract in generations. It challenges us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about work, welfare, citizenship, and the distribution of resources in an age of unprecedented technological capability and environmental urgency. What's most encouraging is how the conversation has evolved from theoretical speculation to evidence-based policy design. The question is no longer simply whether UBI could work, but how it can be optimally designed and implemented to achieve multiple social goals while remaining fiscally sustainable. I believe we're witnessing the early stages of a profound transformation in how societies conceptualize economic security. Whether through full UBI or UBI-adjacent policies, the principle that everyone deserves a basic economic floor is gaining acceptance across political divides. The coming decade will be decisive in determining whether this principle becomes embedded in our economic institutions or remains primarily at the experimental stage.
Dr. Lawrence, thank you for this comprehensive exploration of universal basic income across our 5-part series. We've covered everything from theoretical foundations to the latest innovations and future prospects. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this in-depth examination of one of the most significant policy innovations being considered worldwide. I hope this series has provided valuable insights into both the promise and complexity of universal basic income. This is Sean McGregor for Economic Frontiers. Until next time, keep exploring the boundaries of economic possibility.